Okay, guys, today let's talk about George Washington. We're not talking about George Washington as, the general in the Revolutionary War. We're really talking about George Washington this time as the president. So what did he do after he became the first president? So remember, after the war, he wants to go home and retire, but instead, he's called back into the service of his country for the Constitutional Convention. After the Constitutional Convention, he wants to go home and retire, but he's overwhelmingly selected as the first president, right? He's the only president to receive 100% of the vote, which we'll talk about in a minute as we get into the slides. So, the presidency of George Washington. George Washington is most remembered not because of the major events that happened in his presidency, but really because of the precedents he set. And remember, when we talk about a precedent, we're talking about a standard or a tradition. And these precedents, guys, really helped shape our government and the nation. Washington knew that what he was doing was going to be sort of a role model for future people, so future presidents, I mean. So he really took the time to think about what he was doing in his actions because he wanted to set a good example for the future. Quick little video on George Washington, and then we'll begin to talk about the precedents.
Here's another 2-minute history report.
Think your dad has a lot of responsibility? Imagine being father of a whole country. That's what they call President George Washington. Washington left school at 16 and worked the Shenandoah Valley as a surveyor. You can still see his mark on Virginia's Natural Bridge. He later served as an officer in the French and Indian Wars. He married Martha Dandridge Curtis, one of the wealthiest women in the colonies, and then settled down in his estate, Mount Vernon. In 1787, he attended the Second Continental Congress, where they appointed him chief of the American Army. Yay! After a major defeat to the British in New York, Washington crossed the Delaware in the dead of night to surprise enemy forces in New Jersey. Efforts like these helped America win its independence. Years later, Washington is nominated and elected president, the only president ever to get 100% of the electoral vote. When war broke out between England and France, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson sided with the French. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, argued British support. Washington stood his ground and remained neutral. After winning re-election in 1792, he gave the shortest inaugural speech in U.S. history.
Thank you so much.
135 words. Partially due to dental pain. Washington did wear false teeth, but they were not wooden. They were made of iron. After 8 years, he declined on a third term and retired at Mount Vernon. Today, there is a state, 31 counties, and 17 cities that bear his name, including our country's capital. So here it is in a nutshell. He was a surveyor, a soldier, and a midnight sailor. Married well, spoke briefly, and had ivory chops. He was an inspirational leader and remains as a common name on road maps.
That's George Washington in 3 minutes.
All right, so the first president that we're going to talk about is his inauguration, right? Washington wanted to retire, like we said, but he was elected to be the first president. He was sworn into office on April 30th, 1789, on a balcony in Lower Manhattan in New York City. John Adams was the vice president because he got the second most number of votes in the presidential election. It was done a little bit differently back then than what it's done today, and we'll talk later in a future set of notes about why that was changed. So, after he was sworn in as president, he decided to make a speech that became known as the inaugural address. Basically, he laid out his plans for what he was going to do while he was president. Every president since has made an inaugural address. Down here is the pictures of just some future presidents that would do the same thing, that would follow his example. All right, so which city was George Washington inaugurated in? And like we just said, it was New York City. Okay, the second precedent that he established was the cabinet. The cabinet is the thing that's still around today. Washington was aware that he was going to have so much to do as president, right? And he wasn't going to be able to do it all himself. So he asked Congress to approve a group of advisors that later was called the cabinet. Originally, it started off with 4 different cabinet departments. Today, it's up to 15. So the first department that he established was the State Department. And the State Department handles all foreign relations, anything that deals with other countries. To head that department, he chose Thomas Jefferson, a well-respected man at the time. The Treasury Department handles all financial matters, and the Treasury Department was established by a brilliant mind at the time, Alexander Hamilton. He's the guy in the $10 bill. The War Department provides national defense. It was headed up by a proven Revolutionary War general, Henry Knox. And then they have the Attorney General, which handles all legal affairs, and that was Edmund Randolph was his name. Randolph, sorry. So let's see. What do we call him? That's the next precedent that was established by Washington. People did not know what to call the president. Some people suggested His Highness or His Excellency. John Adams suggested an even longer title for him. Washington stated that he preferred just a simple term like Mr. President. He didn't want to seem too elite or stuck up, right? He wanted to be a man of the people, and addressing him by some formal title resembled too much of a king or too much, like an aristocrat or somebody who's really high up. So he really decided Mr. President's a much more simple term, more relatable to the people. This term stuck, and it's still the appropriate term to use when you're addressing the president. Presidential power. A new tax on whiskey was passed by Alexander Hamilton. All kinds of protests, especially in western Pennsylvania, right? That's really where this was established. Farmers, didn't even use money out there sometimes, but really, they didn't want to pay the tax. So they attacked the tax collectors and really was causing all kinds of chaos out there. So this becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion because the tax specifically dealt on whiskey production and whiskey sales. Washington used his authority that the Constitution gives him as commander-in-chief to go in and actually crush the rebellion. He argued that even though Congress can declare war, it's the president's ability to control the military that makes it okay for him to use the military at his will. This set the precedent that the president could enforce law and mobilize troops, and this power is still used today. So back then, Washington was on his horse and literally rode in. Today, the president would send in planes and bombs and things like that. But either way, it's the president exercising their power as commander-in-chief. Okay, which one of these is not an original cabinet position? The State Department, the War Department, the Foreign Department, or the Attorney General? Okay, and the Foreign Department was not a cabinet position. The other three were. All right, so 2 terms. What is often referred to as one of his most significant precedents was the fact that Washington only served 2 terms. After his second term, he decided not to run for a third term. Although he never passed a law to limit terms, Washington set a precedent of not running for a third term that lasted for over 140 years. It wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt in the late 1930s where he finally decided to run for a third term, breaking this tradition. Today, though, you couldn't do that because there is a law in the books that says you cannot serve over 2 terms. So this precedent was followed for a long time and then eventually becomes a full-fledged law. He was afraid that had he died in office, that would have set the precedent that all presidents are going to be reelected until they die in office. He wanted to make sure that his time was limited, it didn't resemble a king or a dictator, so he really wanted to step down, and that was very unusual at the time for someone just to step down and leave a position of power willingly. Okay, and which is not a precedent that George Washington set? The 2 terms precedent, the call him Mr. President, established a cabinet, or passed a budget? And obviously the answer here is passed a budget. Okay, and sorting the precedents in the appropriate box, Commander-in-Chief is one that dealt with Whiskey Rebellion. What do we call him? Right, that was His Excellency was one of the possibilities. Establishing a cabinet meant there was too much for one man. The inaugural address was his statement in New York City and only serving 2 terms, so he didn't overstay his welcome, maybe much like a king would. Okay, and this concludes this set of notes. Don't forget to do your margins and your reflections.